Before France became the nation we recognize today, the land existed without a name, a crown, or defined borders. It was a realm characterized by vast forests, the whisper of the wind, and profound silence. Here, people lived in a scattered manner, deeply rooted in their surroundings and closely attuned to the rhythms of nature. They would later be referred to as Celts or Gauls, though they themselves did not identify with this term. Instead of existing within a singular empire, they inhabited numerous small worlds, tribes, villages, and clearings. They hunted, traded, and honored the changing seasons. Their knowledge was not recorded in written texts, but was passed down orally. The elders shared stories while the young listened, allowing memories to traverse through time. As we delve deeper into this narrative, I invite you to share in the comments where you are listening from and at what time. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, your support through subscriptions and likes would greatly assist me in sharing more such stories. Thank you for your encouragement. The Gauls were not merely simple farmers. They were skilled in metallurgy, adorned themselves with vibrant fabrics, and traveled in wagons through the dense forests and rolling hills. Their world was wild, yet far from primitive. The Druids, regarded as wise figures, communicated with the gods, mediated disputes, and possessed knowledge of the stars and plants. No single king ruled over all of Gaul. Each tribe operated independently, yet they were united by more than what divided them. Language, faith, shared stories, a quiet understanding of nature, and a gaze toward the south. There, beyond the horizon, a new order was rising. The Roman Empire, solid and proud, organized and formidable. Initially, Roman merchants ventured into Gaul, followed by soldiers, and eventually the construction of roads. The Gauls were unaware of the impending changes. Their fires still crackled, their songs echoed through the hills. Yet in the distance, something new began to resonate, foreign, powerful, and inevitable. The tranquility of Gaul would one day be shattered by the thunder of foreign footsteps. These were not nomadic riders nor merchants with carts. They were legionaries. Disciplined and armored, marching in formation, Rome had set its sights on the land north of the Alps, and Gaul would not remain untouched. The first contacts were made across the Mediterranean Sea. The city of Massalia, present-day Marseille, served as a Greek outpost that had long been engaged in trade with the Romans. However, the true turning point came with a man destined to alter the course of history, Gaius Julius Caesar. In the 50s before Christ, Caesar initiated his Gallic Wars. Over the span of 7 years, he led his troops through rivers, swamps, mountains, and dense forests. He fought against the Helvetii, the Belgae, the Veneti, and ultimately against Vercingetorix, the leader of the Gallic resistance. This formidable leader united many tribes, yet even his steadfastness could not halt the advance of Rome. In the year 52 before Christ, Alesia fell, marking the collapse of the last significant hope for a free Gaul. Vercingetorix was captured and later displayed publicly in Rome before being executed. Gaul had been defeated and was now to become a province of the Roman Empire. However, the Romans arrived not only with swords, but also with roads, bridges, and aqueducts. They established cities, including Lutetia, which is present-day Paris, as well as Lugdunum, which later became Lyon. They introduced new laws, a new administration, and a new language. The Gallic warriors were transformed into citizens of the empire, at least on paper. This transition did not occur overnight. Many traditions remained intact. Customs, deities, and stories persisted. Gradually, however, the worlds began to merge. Gallic gods were given Roman names. Temples were remodeled, and markets were reorganized. The Latin language spread, particularly in the cities. Those who wished to belong had to adapt. At the same time, A new sense of identity was emerging in Gaul. It was no longer merely occupied land, but rather a part of the Roman order. Gauls fought in Roman armies and served as officials. Some even rose to the ranks of the Senate. The distinction between the conquered and the conquerors began to blur. Yet, in the shadows, something unique remained. In remote villages, ancient rituals were handed down. There, the old languages were spoken, and the ancient forces were honored. Rome may have ruled, but it did not possess everything. For over 3 centuries, Gaul remained part of the Roman Empire. During this time, the land underwent profound changes, culturally, economically, and spiritually. Yet it also remained somewhat insular. The Romans viewed it as part of civilization, but for many Gauls, Rome was a distant heart, not their own. As the power of Rome began to wane, with legions withdrawing and borders becoming uncertain, Gaul had long since evolved beyond being merely a conquered territory. It was interwoven with Roman stone, Roman order, and Roman gods, yet beneath it all, the ancient Gallic rhythm still pulsed. It was only a matter of time before new forces would sense and fill this vacuum. And they would not come from the south, but from the north. No empire, no senate, no emperor, but a people whose name would endure for centuries. In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, a quiet shadow loomed over Gaul. The Roman roads still existed, the cities retained their names, and Latin continued to be spoken. But something had shifted. The order that once seemed unshakable began to crumble, not with a loud bang, but with many small cracks that slowly but steadily spread through the fabric of society. Tax revenues dwindled, legions were withdrawn, and the administration increasingly turned in on itself. In many regions, people were left to their own devices. In the places where Roman officials once rendered judgments, local dignitaries, bishops, or tribal leaders now assumed responsibility. This period, in which the old had not yet completely vanished and the new had yet to find its name, opened a space that was both geographical and spiritual. It was a time of transition, shrouded in uncertainty. Ancient gods faded into obscurity, while new prayers began to whisper through the churches. Monks in remote monasteries took on the vital task of preserving the knowledge of antiquity. The faith that had once emerged from the east began to take root deeply within the Gallic soul. As Rome crumbled from within, new forces began to fill the vacuum left behind. The Germanic tribes, who had lived along the borders of the empire for centuries, emerged as new players on the stage of history. Vandals, Alans, Visigoths, all traversed the land, settling and claiming names. Yet among these groups, one in particular stood out, the Franks. Originating from the region along the Rhine, the Franks formed a loose confederation of several tribes. Their name meant the bold, and this was reflected in their demeanor. They did not come merely to pass through, they intended to stay. However, they did not arrive as ruthless conquerors. Rather, they approached as adaptable forces, negotiating and observing. Unlike other groups, they proceeded with caution. Many settled in northeastern Gaul, forging alliances with the local populace and beginning to integrate. Some adopted Latin terms, while others converted to Christianity, a faith that had previously been foreign to them. Yet they understood that to establish roots in this land, they needed to do more than just fight. From these initial, tentative beginnings, a young leader began to rise. His name was Clovis. He was ambitious, shrewd, and recognized that power did not lie solely in the sword. He understood that a people could not be held together by fear alone, but by something deeper, shared hope, faith, and a common history. By this time, the Western Roman Empire had already fallen in the year 476. The last emperor had been deposed, and no one claimed his throne. It was as if history itself had paused, preparing for a new beginning. At this moment, when so much was lost, and yet nothing had truly begun. Gaul slowly began to shift in a new direction. In the cities, columns fell, but bells began to ring. In the fields, sowing was no longer done in the name of the emperor, but in trust of what was to come. In the hearts of the people, a sense grew that the face of their land would change, not through foreign power, but from within. Without grand announcements or a set plan, a new chapter was taking shape. At the heart of this gradual and profound transformation stood a young man adorned with a crown of will and instinct. From these initial, tentative beginnings, a young leader began to rise. His name was Clovis. He was ambitious, shrewd, and recognized that power did not lie solely in the sword. He understood that a people could not be held together by fear alone, but by something deeper, shared hope, faith, and a common history. By this time, the Western Roman Empire had already fallen in the year 476. The last emperor had been deposed, and no one claimed his throne. It was as if history itself had paused, preparing for a new beginning. At this moment, when so much was lost, and yet nothing had truly begun, Gaul slowly began to shift in a new direction. In the cities, columns fell, but bells began to ring. In the fields, sowing was no longer done in the name of the emperor, but in trust of what was to come. In the hearts of the people, a sense grew that the face of their land would change, not through foreign power, but from within. Without grand announcements or a set plan, a new chapter was taking shape. At the heart of this gradual and profound transformation stood a young man adorned with a crown of will and instinct, poised to reshape the legacy of a fallen realm into a new form. He was still in his youth when he first heard of the Roman world, not through books or from teachers, but through the tales of older warriors who spoke of cities with towering walls, streets paved with stone, and gods who remained unyielding. Clovis, a son of the Frankish Merovingian dynasty, grew up in an era when nothing seemed certain, yet everything appeared possible. Gaul lay shrouded in the mist between two epochs. The Roman order had vanished, yet its ruins still loomed large. The people clung to ancient customs while simultaneously seeking new anchors in their lives. Amidst this transition, Clovis emerged, not as a ruler of a well-established kingdom, but as a leader of a band that relied on their bravery and skill. He understood that mere strength would not suffice. His ambition was not solely to conquer, but to unite. Thus, he began, step by step, to gather other Frankish groups under his banner, employing not only the sword, but also astute diplomacy. He married Clotilda, a Burgundian princess who was a Christian. Her faith would not transform him immediately, yet she spoke of it often, gently and persistently, with the patience of a woman who understood that conviction cannot be commanded. The decision to embrace her faith did not occur in an instant. Rather, it grew over the years. It was not just the influence of codicil that prompted his reflection, but also the course of a battle that led him to ponder his beliefs. During a fierce confrontation against the Alemanni, his army found itself in dire straits. In that moment of desperation, Clovis did not call upon the old gods. Instead, he turned to the god of his wife, and he emerged victorious. Shortly thereafter, in the year 499, he underwent baptism in Reims. This act bore immense symbolic significance, not merely a personal step, but a message to all who dwelled within his realm. The faith that had once originated from the East and was carried by Rome now belonged to them as well. Unlike many of the Germanic rulers of his time, Clovis did not adopt Arianism. Instead, he aligned himself with the Roman Catholic tradition. This was a shrewd move that brought him closer to the spiritual center of the Gallic Roman populace. However, merely changing his faith was not enough. Clovis waged wars, defeating the Visigoths to the south, subjugating the last remnants of independent tribes, and thereby laying the foundation for a new kingdom, not entirely Roman, nor wholly Germanic, but something uniquely his own. The people began to define themselves not solely by tribal affiliation, but by a shared territory, a common faith, and a burgeoning new identity. This realm was still young, unfinished, and rife with internal tensions. Yet it possessed something that many other kingdoms lacked, a sense of unity and purpose that would guide its future. A direction and a leader emerged, one who understood that power was more than mere violence. It rested on unity, and unity required symbols. Thus, from the wild land of Gaul emerged an empire with a centre, a vision, and a religion. As Clovis laid down his sword and embraced the cross, the very notion of what it meant to rule transformed. No longer was dominion defined solely by strength. It was now characterized by the ability to unite. It was in the century after Christ that a new storm swept across the land, not from the north or east, as had often been the case, but from the distant south. Arab armies, buoyed by the winds of a new religion, had overrun Spain and now stood at the gates of Gaul. Their ambitions extended beyond mere wealth. They sought influence and aimed to expand Islam into northern Europe. At this juncture, the Frankish realm was not a monolithic state, but rather a patchwork of regions, tribal territories, ancient Roman cities, and emerging Frankish power structures. The Merovingian kings still existed, yet their authority had become tenuous. The real decisions were being made by others, one of whom was Charles Martel. He served as the mayor of the palace, a steward at the court of the Frankish kings, but in reality, he wielded the reins of power. A man of clear vision, resolute will, and military acumen, his name, Martel the Hammer, would soon signify more than just a nickname. In the year 737, the Muslim forces crossed the Pyrenees. They marched through Aquitaine, pillaging towns as they advanced northward. The Christian princes of the land were overwhelmed and divided. It was Charles who recognized that this was no ordinary invasion. It was a pivotal moment that could determine the fate of the West. In the autumn of that year, he confronted the invaders with his army at Tours, situated between the Loire and the Vienne rivers. This was not a grand field battle, adorned with pomp and trumpets. It was quieter, more focused. Charles positioned his men defensively, in tight formation, amidst the terrain that favored strategy. For days, the two armies watched one another, waiting for the right moment. When the Arab cavalry finally launched their assault, they crashed against a bulwark of shields, spears, and disciplined soldiers. Time and again they charged, only to be repelled. Eventually, their leader fell, and confusion erupted among the invaders. Under the cover of night, they retreated, leaving their camp abandoned by morning. Charles Martel had triumphed, but it was not the clamour of victory that rendered this battle significant. It was its impact. With this victory, a boundary was drawn, not solely in geographical terms, but culturally as well. The Arab expansion was halted, and the Frankish realm emerged more clearly than ever as the defender of Christian Europe. Yet, Charles sought no glory for himself. He did not return as a celebrated king, but rather as a quiet strategist. He understood that this victory was merely a beginning, a first step in a much larger struggle that lay ahead. The Frankish territories remained fragmented, with the monarchy weak and new dangers looming on the horizon. However, through the pivotal battle at Tours, a singular moment of determination had shifted the balance of power in Europe. It was not Rome nor Byzantium, but the Franks who emerged as the new force of order. When Charlemagne was born, no one could foresee that this child would grow into a ruler whose name would endure for centuries. He was the grandson of Charles Martel, the very man who had once turned the tide of Europe at Tours. The blood of that hammer of the Franks coursed through his veins. Yet, while one had achieved defense, the other would complete the task of building. Charlemagne was born in the year 742 into a world that was both harsh and in a state of change. The Frankish Empire had expanded, yet it was still marked by ancient tribal boundaries, local princes, and fragile alliances. Upon the death of his father, Pepin the Short, Charlemagne inherited the realm alongside his brother Carloman. However, Carloman died prematurely, leaving Charlemagne with the entirety of the inheritance. He was not a king sitting idly in opulent halls. Rather, he was a ruler constantly on the move. A wandering monarch, he traversed his empire, inspecting fortresses, planning military campaigns, and enacting laws. His physical and intellectual stature impressed contemporaries as well as later chroniclers. Yet it was not merely his presence that made him unforgettable, but rather his monumental achievements. Charlemagne waged numerous wars against the Saxons in the northeast, battling them for decades until he ultimately compelled their conversion to Christianity. He also fought against the Lombards in Italy, the Arabs at sea, and the Avars along the Danube. However, his ambition was not solely territorial expansion, it was the establishment of order. He envisioned an empire held together not just by strength, but also by faith and administration. In the year 800, on a cold winter's night, Charlemagne knelt in Rome for Mass. When he rose, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head, bestowing upon him the title of Emperor of the Roman Empire. It was no longer the old Rome, but it symbolized the emergence of a new realm, the Frankish Empire, as a revival of Western imperial glory. Yet Charlemagne was more than just a warrior and emperor. He was also a patron of education, founding schools and inviting scholars to his court. In Aachen, his favored residence, he gathered knowledge that had been forgotten in other regions. Latin was cultivated, manuscripts were copied, and Christianity was taught. This period would later be referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance, a brief flourishing in dark times. Simultaneously, Charlemagne established a sophisticated administrative system. He dispatched what were known as missi dominici, royal envoys who travelled throughout the realm in his name, uncovering injustices and legal issues. He sought to understand what transpired in the most remote corners of his land. Control, but also care. That was his principle. Yet, despite all his greatness, his empire was not free from fissures. After the death of Charlemagne in the year 814, his son, Louis the Pious, ascended to the throne. However, it did not take long for the empire to face what many great realms encounter: fragmentation. Charlemagne's grandsons began to quarrel among themselves, leading to a division of the empire that would eventually give rise to both France and the German Empire. Charlemagne himself is remembered as the Father of Europe, a title bestowed upon him not because he was a flawless ruler, but because he dared to undertake a vision larger than himself, an empire founded not solely on conquest, but also on education, faith, and order. His burial site in Aachen became a pilgrimage destination, his name a standard of measure, and his dream of a Christian united Europe would be invoked frequently in the centuries that followed, though it was often left unfulfilled. Following Charlemagne's passing, his monumental achievements did not immediately fade into obscurity. Nevertheless, it quickly became evident how fragile the unity he had established truly was. Louis, often referred to as the Pious, inherited the empire, yet his reign was marked by internal tensions, unrest, and an increasing fragmentation of the realm. Louis endeavored to preserve his father's legacy, but his decisions, particularly the early division of the empire among his sons, led to conflicts, as not all brothers were willing to share. Some aspired to rule. Consequently, after his death, a bitter war of succession erupted among his three sons. This struggle culminated in the Treaty of Verdun, signed in the year 843. For the first time, this document officially divided the Frankish Empire into three major parts: a western region, a central corridor, and an eastern realm. The western portion, known as the West Frankish Kingdom, would form the core of what later became France. It encompassed large areas of present-day French territory and was granted to Charlemagne's son, Charles the Bald. However, this new order was far from stable. Frequent border disputes, changes in the throne, and regional uprisings plagued the realm. The power of the kings often existed only on paper. In reality, local princes, dukes, and counts exercised authority over their respective territories. Although the king was present, his influence frequently did not extend beyond the walls of his residence. At the same time, new threats loomed over the land. From the north, the Vikings descended upon the coasts, pillaging cities such as Rouen and Paris. Their swift ships, tactical prowess, and ruthless nature posed significant challenges to the Frankish rulers. In an attempt to placate them, they were eventually granted their own settlement area, which would later be known as Normandy. Yet, while the West Frankish kingdom found itself in a state of perpetual uncertainty, a new dynasty began to emerge slowly into prominence, the Carolingians. In the year 998, Hugh Capet was elected king, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the history of France. Not because he was powerful, but because the princes regarded him as weak and easily manipulated. What was initially intended as a temporary solution would evolve into the beginning of a long reign, as the Capetians skillfully expanded their influence, piece by piece, with patience and a clear vision. They shifted the focus of royal power to Paris, which gradually grew into the political heart of the nation. They forged alliances, arranged astute marriages for their children, and strengthened their standing against the princes. Culturally, the country began to transform. The French language, which had emerged from the spoken Latin of the Gallo-Roman populace, continued to evolve and became the language of the court, poetry, and administration. The church played a central role in the lives of the people, with the Christian faith deeply rooted in their daily existence. Thus, what we recognize today as France slowly began to take shape, not through a single blow or a grand event, but through a centuries-long struggle for power, identity, and unity. The Carolingian Empire had faded into history, yet its legacy persisted in structures, traditions, and memories. While the land was still marked by external threats and internal tensions, the contours of a distinct French history began to emerge. It was still young, fragile, and incomplete, but it had commenced. In the heart of the West Frankish kingdom, something more than just a capital was growing. Paris, once a Roman settlement along the Seine, was now becoming the quiet center of a nation in the process of reorganization. Amid stone bridges, narrow alleys, and the towers of churches, a new pulse began to resonate, politically, spiritually, and culturally. The Capetians, whose influence initially barely extended beyond their ancestral lands, recognized early on the potential of this city. It did not present an overwhelmingly powerful image, nor was it as wealthy as other places, or as grand as the capitals of distant empires. Yet, it was strategically located, easily defensible, surrounded by fertile lands, and perhaps most importantly, it was centrally positioned. Under rulers such as Philip II and Louis VI, royal power began to solidify. These kings were not conquerors, rather, they were administrators. They ruled not with brute force, but through networks, marital alliances, and the astute use of ecclesiastical authority. Their collaboration with the church granted them additional legitimacy, for those anointed from heaven were expected to be obeyed on earth. Particularly under Philip II, known as Augustus, the French monarchy gained renewed strength. He reigned from the late 12th century and led the country with a clear vision and decisive hand. During his reign, Paris became the political nerve center, and simultaneously, An intellectual elite began to emerge there, setting the stage for France's future development. The University of Paris, which emerged from early ecclesiastical schools, attracted students and teachers from across Europe. Theologians, philosophers, and poets congregated within the narrow courtyards and halls of this burgeoning center of learning. While discussions and teachings flourished in the city, the French realm steadily expanded. Philip Augustus seized significant portions of English territories in France, including Normandy and Anjou. This maneuver pushed back the English crown, securing new lands and resources for the French monarchy. It marked a pivotal moment. From a fragmented system of rule, a unified kingdom began to take shape. However, this transformation was not a smooth ascent. Conflicts with powerful noble families arose repeatedly, leading to uprisings and diplomatic tensions. The Capetians had to exercise patience, build trust, and forge alliances. Paris remained their stronghold, a bastion of stability during a time of upheaval. Concurrently, the concept of kingship was evolving. The ruler was no longer merely a war leader, but increasingly took on the roles of judge, legislator, and father to his subjects. He traveled across the land, addressed petitions, resolved disputes, and although his authority was not uniformly strong, it grew not through noise, but through perseverance. In the daily lives of the people, this shift was hardly reflected. Peasants continued to till their fields, craftsmen labored in the towns, and pilgrims journeyed to sacred cities. Yet an emerging sentiment lingered above all, a feeling that there was something uniting France, not solely through language or faith, but through a growing awareness of a shared order. The Capetians did not seize an empire in turmoil. They forged it slowly over generations, with patience, diplomatic skill, and a belief in the power of the throne. At the heart of this endeavor stood a city that held it all together: Paris, the modest heart of an emerging state. The roots of conflict ran deep, entrenched in ancient claims, dynastic entanglements, and wounded pride. When King Charles VI of France died in the year without a male heir, the question arose: who would succeed him? The French crown viewed itself as indivisible, reserved exclusively for male heirs. Yet Edward II of England, the grandson of a former French king, also laid claim. The French nobility rejected him, and instead appointed Philip from the House of Valois. What began as a legal dispute soon escalated into war, a war that would last over a century. The so-called 100 Years' War, which actually spanned 116 years, was not a continuous conflict. It comprised a series of campaigns, truces, internal crises, and unexpected turns. Yet, it was always about more than just succession. It was a struggle for honor, influence, and control over land and sea. England, deeply rooted in France through its overseas possessions, landed its troops on the French coast and achieved remarkable victories in the early phases of the war. At the Battle of Crécy in the year 1346, and again at Poitiers 9 years later, the English forces defeated a numerically superior French army. The proud French knighthood, clad in heavy armor, proved vulnerable to the swift and disciplined English archers. These were years marked by defeat, internal strife, pillaging, and famine. Entire regions were devastated. Villages were set ablaze, and crops were destroyed. The populace suffered not only from the ravages of battle, but also from the caprice of marauding mercenaries, rising taxes, and the constant fear of the next raid. As the dawn of the 15th century approached, it seemed that all was lost. Paris fell into English hands, forcing the French royal court to flee. The nation was fractured. Yet it was precisely during this time of profound despair that a figure emerged from the shadows. She was scarcely more than a girl, inexperienced but filled with a voice that called her I. She was a peasant girl from Lorraine, who claimed to have divine visions. Her appearance raised many questions, yet she impressed all with her clarity, courage, and unwavering faith in France's victory. Against all odds, she was introduced to the Dauphin Charles. Given a small army, she led them to victory at Orléans in the year 1419. This triumph was more than just a military success. It was a spark that rekindled a dying flame. France regained its courage. The Dauphin was crowned in Reims, an act of immense symbolic weight. However, Joan of Arc was captured shortly thereafter, handed over to the English, condemned as a heretic, and burned at the stake. She died young, yet her influence endured. France found its resolve once more. Its troops became better organized, and the royal power consolidated itself. Step by step, the French pushed the English back. By the end of the war, the English held only Calais. What remained was a wounded but revitalized France. The war had deeply scarred the land, yet it had also united it. From a fragile kingdom, a nation had emerged, slowly rediscovering itself, shaped by pain but buoyed by hope. Once devastated fields began to bear fruit again. Cities that had been on the brink of decay awakened to new life. In the halls of the nobility, a new yearning began to stir, a longing for beauty, order, and knowledge. It was the time of the Renaissance, a gradual yet profound renewal that had its roots in Italy. In cities such as Florence, Rome, and Venice, a remarkable revival began to unfold as the writings of antiquity were rediscovered. The ancient philosophers, mathematicians, and poets, who had long remained shrouded in obscurity, now stepped back into the light of intellectual inquiry. Initially, France observed this transformative movement from a distance, but soon it became an integral part of this spiritual renaissance. Under the Valois dynasty, which had been in power since the late Middle Ages, doors swung open for artists, architects, and scholars alike. This cultural flourishing reached its zenith during the reign of King Francis I, who ascended the throne in the year 1515. Francis was more than a mere ruler. He was a patron, a true lover of the arts. Under his auspices, magnificent castles were constructed, not merely as fortresses, but as vibrant centers of life, thought, and representation. The Château de Chambord emerged during this period, along with many other splendid structures along the Loire River, whose elegance continues to be admired to this day. However, it was not solely architecture that underwent a transformation. The realm of thought also took flight. Universities began to gain prominence, and the art of printing spread like wildfire. The French language began to establish itself as a written language, standing alongside Latin, which still dominated churches and schools. The foundations of French literature were laid, giving rise to a new self-awareness regarding language and identity among the people. In a significant move, Francis I invited Leonardo da Vinci to France. The great Italian master spent his final years at the king's court, bringing with him his drawings, ideas, and visionary concepts. He passed away in Amboise, near the royal chateau, leaving behind an enduring legacy that would resonate for generations. Yet, despite the profound quest for knowledge that characterized this era, it was not devoid of tensions. As the light of the Renaissance shone brighter, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. The religious unity of Europe started to fracture. In the distant town of Wittenberg, Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door, an act that would reverberate throughout Europe and would not leave France untouched. Initially, the reformative movement was small, but soon its ideas found an audience among French circles. A Protestant minority, known as the Huguenots, began to take shape. What began as a spiritual debate gradually evolved into an explosive tension between reform and tradition, between old dogmas and new paths. Yet, for the moment, the country appeared to remain in balance. The Renaissance had sown the seeds of elegance, intellect, and openness. The great cities became thriving centers of exchange, commerce, and interaction. Although the years ahead would once again shake the nation, the memory of this epoch remained vibrant. It was not loud or revolutionary, but it was profound and deeply felt. The French Renaissance marked a subtle yet significant awakening in thought, laying the groundwork for a society that aspired to be more than just a legacy of the past. It sought to be the architect of its own future. What began as a ripple of new ideas soon escalated into a tempest that shook the nation to its core. This period of cultural rebirth opened France to the realms of art, science, and education. However, it also raised profound questions regarding power, truth, and faith. The teachings of Martin Luther found resonance in France, yet it was primarily John Calvin, a native of France, who shaped this new movement into a more defined form. His ideas spread rapidly, particularly among segments of the bourgeoisie, urban elites, and nobility. His followers were known as Huguenots. They sought not a new kingdom, but a renewed understanding of faith. However, this quest for a redefined belief system was perilous in a society dominated by monarchy, where the French king perceived himself not only as a secular ruler, but also as the guardian of the Catholic faith. What began with sermons and writings soon devolved into violence. By the 1560s, open civil war erupted, and 8 phases of conflict would ravage the land over nearly 4 decades. On one side stood the Catholic crown, bolstered by conservative noble families such as the powerful Guise. Opposing them were the Huguenots, led by figures like Admiral Coligny and Henry of Navarre. The violence was pervasive, with cities frequently changing hands, monasteries plundered, and churches burned to the ground. People were persecuted not only for their origins, but also for their beliefs. Distrust permeated entire villages, and families were torn apart. It was not a foreign army that devastated the land. It was the neighbor next door. The darkest moment of this tumultuous period occurred on an August night in the year 1572. Paris was supposed to celebrate the wedding between the Catholic Marguerite of Valois and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, a symbol of reconciliation. Yet, what was intended as an act of peace turned into a deadly trap. By order of the royal family, or at least with their tacit approval, a massacre of Huguenots commenced. During this St. Bartholomew's night, thousands perished, and the bloodshed spread to many cities. Trust was irreparably shattered. From that moment on, there was no safe haven, no neutral zone. The war continued, interrupted only by fragile peace, constantly shaken by fresh attacks and new reprisals. The state itself appeared to have lost its direction. Amidst this chaos, a figure emerged who would lead to a turning point: Henry of Navarre. A Protestant, educated and pragmatic, he found himself in the line of succession after a series of dynastic upheavals. In a bid to unify France, he made the momentous decision to convert to Catholicism. Not out of inner conviction, but rather from political calculation, he is said to have remarked, "Paris is worth a mass." In the year 1600, he ascended the throne as Henry IV, and just a few years later, he issued the Edict of Nantes, a pivotal law that granted the Huguenots freedom of worship and assured them certain rights of protection. While this did not mark the end of tensions, it was a significant step towards reconciliation. Ultimately, Henry IV fell victim to an assassination, yet his policy of reconciliation left a lasting impact. France had suffered deeply, but it had endured, and from its wounds began to emerge the first fragile threads of a new order. When Louis XIV took the French throne in the year 1648, he was merely 5 years old, far too young to govern, far too young to grasp the weight of being King of France. However, in the quietude of his childhood, a determination began to take root that would shape the nation for decades to come. The early years of his reign were guided by Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian who possessed not only diplomatic skill, but also a keen sense of the dynamics of power. During this tumultuous period, Louis experienced the upheaval of the civil war known as the Fronde, in which factions of the nobility and parliament rose against the crown. The young king was forced to flee Paris at times, and he did not forget the feeling of vulnerability that accompanied such weakness. Upon Mazarin's death in the year 1761, Louis took the reins of government upon himself, choosing not to appoint a new minister. L'État, c'est moi, he is famously reported to have declared. This phrase became the guiding principle of an era characterized by absolutism. Louis ruled with an iron fist, yet he was also imbued with a sense of beauty, order, and grandeur. He saw himself not only as a secular ruler, but as a reflection of divine authority. In his vision, the king was the center of the universe, akin to the sun around which everything revolved. Nothing was to exist outside his influence. He constructed Versailles, perhaps the most magnificent palace of his time, not merely as a residence, but as a stage for power. The court lived according to his rhythm, where every step, every gesture, and every glance became part of a performance orchestrated by Louis himself. The nobility were bound by etiquette rather than chains. They were allowed to shine, provided they remained in his proximity. However, this age of splendor was not merely theatrical. Louis also reformed the administration, creating central offices and strengthening control over finances, justice, and the military. He led France into a cultural renaissance, fostering advancements in architecture, literature, and painting, all emblematic of French greatness. The Académie Française became the guardian of the language, and the French style set a standard across Europe. Simultaneously, Louis engaged in numerous wars, seeking to secure and expand France's borders while asserting its dominance within the realm. The War of Devolution, the Dutch Wars, and the War of the Palatine Succession. Each of these conflicts exacted a toll in terms of finances, lives, and resources. In the beginning, France experienced a period of notable success, yet as time progressed, the number of adversaries increased. Numerous European realms formed alliances to curtail the power of Louis XIV. Domestically, Louis made a decision that would leave profound consequences. In the year 1685, he once again issued the Edict of Nantes. This marked the revocation of religious freedom for the Huguenots, leading to the destruction of their churches and the closure of their schools. Many Huguenots fled to Prussia, the Netherlands, and England. Consequently, France not only lost citizens, but also skilled workers, merchants, and scholars. The economic repercussions were significant and palpable. Despite this, the splendor of the kingdom remained intact. Louis reigned for over 70 years, making his tenure the longest of any European monarch. When he passed away in the year 1715, he was an elderly man, worn out yet resolutely determined to secure the legacy of his reign. His great-grandson, also named Louis, was set to follow in his footsteps. However, the image of the Sun King overshadowed any potential successors for a long time. What Louis XIV bequeathed was a France at the zenith of its grandeur, yet simultaneously a nation that was economically drained, politically dependent on an overly centralized apparatus, and socially deeply divided. The absolutism he had established brought order, but also rigidity. It generated greatness, but also constriction. The sun had sustained the land, yet it had also blinded it. Unbeknownst to many, shadows were already gathering beneath the golden sheen, shadows that would one day eclipse everything that Versailles had ever illuminated. In the 18th century, France was both admired and internally torn. Versailles continued to shine resplendently in gold, while courtiers walked beneath crystal chandeliers, and operas resonated in magnificent theatres. Yet outside in the fields, in the narrow streets of cities, beneath the roofs of simple families, a different sentiment was brewing. The Enlightenment had not appeared suddenly. It had grown gradually through books, conversations, letters, and encounters. In the salons of Paris, in the studies of Lyon, on marketplaces and in cafes, discussions shifted away from mere talk of fashion or commerce to encompass reason, equality, and freedom. Diderot wrote in his encyclopedia. Rousseau spoke of a social contract. Montesquieu contemplated the separation of powers. These ideas spread through pamphlets and printed works, carried by a class that could read but was not yet permitted to decide, the educated bourgeoisie. Meanwhile, the monarchy clung to its established order. The nobility and clergy enjoyed extensive privileges, often exempt from taxes, living in their own cosmos of rules, titles, and expectations. The Third Estate, comprising peasants, workers, merchants, and teachers, bore the weight of the state on their shoulders, but had no voice in decision-making. Crises exacerbated the prevailing discontent. Several poor harvests led to widespread hunger. Bread prices soared, while wages stagnated, further fueling the growing unrest among the populace. At the same time, the extravagant court continued to consume vast sums of money to maintain its opulence. The state treasury was depleted, and trust in King Louis XVI waned. King Louis, well-meaning yet weak, sought a solution. He convened the Estates General, a body that had not met in nearly 2 centuries. This assembly was intended to provide counsel on taxes and reforms. However, from the very opening in the year 1789, it became evident that the 3 estates existed in entirely different worlds. The Third Estate, representing the common people, demanded greater influence and soon declared itself the National Assembly. They vowed not to disband in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles until a constitution had been established. Meanwhile, outside in Paris, discontented crowds were gathering. The words of philosophers had intertwined with the daily struggles of the populace. On the 14th of July, that same year, throngs of people stormed the Bastille, a prison that had become a symbol of royal tyranny. The fortress was only lightly manned, yet its fall sent shockwaves throughout Europe. In the provinces, tax registers were burned, nobles fled, and new orders began to emerge in the cities. Within a matter of weeks, the National Assembly accomplished what had previously seemed unthinkable: the abolition of feudal rights, the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen, and the transformation of France into a constitutional monarchy. This was not merely a political earthquake. It represented a profound shift in thought and society. The church also lost its influence as properties were confiscated and monasteries dissolved. The king, once crowned by divine right, was now merely a citizen with a crown, scrutinized, criticized, and challenged. Yet, unity proved elusive. Radical factions began to gain traction, and political groups such as the Jacobins formed. Uncertainty reigned in the streets, as the nation navigated a tumultuous period where much seemed possible, but nothing was guaranteed. While the mirrors in Versailles still gleamed, the eyes of the people reflected new hopes alongside dark forebodings. A transformation was underway, irrevocable, deep, and unstoppable. What began as a quest for renewal quickly escalated into a storm. The French Revolution, initially fueled by Enlightenment ideals and a spirit of reform, morphed into a colossal movement that sought to upend everything previously deemed unassailable. Following the storming of the Bastille, revolutionary fervor spread throughout the nation. The populace in villages and cities clamored for change. The National Assembly in Paris enacted bold laws. Feudal rights were abolished, the church was dispossessed, and a new constitution was being prepared. France was in the throes of transformation. Yet with each step, the balance appeared to grow more precarious. King Louis XVI increasingly lost authority. Although he had consented to reforms, he secretly harbored doubts about their viability. In the year that followed, he attempted to flee the country in secret with his family. In disguise, he attempted to cross the border into Luxembourg. However, in the town of Warrens, he was recognized and brought back, not as a ruler, but as a suspect. This scene etched itself deeply into the collective memory of the nation. The father of the nation was now reduced to the status of a mere prisoner. The rift between the people and the monarchy had become irrevocable. In Paris, the influence of radical groups began to swell. The Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, demanded more than mere reforms. They sought a completely new France. In their eyes, there was no longer any room for the crown, the church, or the nobility. The revolution gnawed at the very heart of society. In the year 1791, France was declared a republic, and the monarchy was abolished. The king was now merely a citizen, and he was charged, convicted, and publicly executed by guillotine in January of the following year. The guillotine, originally conceived as a tool for swift justice, transformed into a symbol of a new era, one of equality but also of fear. The revolution became increasingly characterized by distrust and suspicion. Those who did not speak loudly enough in its favor were deemed enemies, while those who reformed too cautiously were labeled traitors. Thus began the Reign of Terror, known as the Terror. Under Robespierre's leadership, thousands were executed. Nobles, priests, officials, writers, and even ordinary citizens who happened to say the wrong thing at the wrong time fell victim to this grim fate. The guillotine no longer represented justice. It stood for a system devoid of mercy. The sound of falling blades echoed through the cities as neighbors denounced one another. Paris, once a bastion of philosophy, had become a stage for bloody consequences. In the name of freedom, people were tortured. In the name of equality, property was confiscated. And in the name of brotherhood, divisions were deepened. Yet, as with all movements that grow too strong, too fast, and too uncontrollably, the Reign of Terror began to unravel. Robespierre, once celebrated as the savior of the Republic, became a victim of the very apparatus he had created. In July of 1794, he was arrested and executed without trial, without mercy. His death marked the end of the bloodiest phase of the revolution. A time of sobering reflection began, alongside a reorientation of values. France sought a path between chaos and order, between old structures and new hopes. The so-called Directory assumed control of the government, a college of 5 men tasked with stabilizing the Republic. However, these years were marred by corruption, economic crises, and political paralysis. Meanwhile, war raged across Europe. The monarchies of the continent viewed Republican France as a threat and sought to contain the revolution before it could spread to their own peoples. France defended itself, but it did not stop there. It exported its revolutionary ideas through military means. The war became an instrument of ideology. In this tumultuous conflict, a figure emerged who had previously gone unnoticed by many. A young Corsican general, endowed with sharp intelligence, unwavering ambition, and an unyielding sense of opportunity, emerged during this critical period. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Within the heart of France, he was celebrated as a savior, a force of order, and a genius. The Directory was weak, and the Republic was weary. Napoleon promised security, glory, and unity, and many were willing to sacrifice their freedom once again for these ideals. In the year 1999, he staged a coup to seize power. The revolution that had once liberated the people was now at an end, not with a thunderous explosion, but rather through a decisive step into a new order. What remained was a France that many could hardly recognize. The Bastille had long since fallen, yet its echo lingered on. The rallying cries of freedom, equality, and brotherhood had transformed the nation. These three words carried both triumph and tragedy. They had toppled the crown, yet failed to extinguish the desire for leadership. They had renewed society, but had also caused profound divisions. Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the Mediterranean island of Corsica in the year 1769, was not an aristocrat in the traditional sense, but rather a product of the upheavals of his time. As revolutionary France grew tired of unrest, a man emerged who personified all that the populace yearned for: order, stability, and the simultaneous dream of greatness. His rise to prominence was rapid. With a clear mind, strategic acumen, and an almost unshakable self-confidence, he quickly ascended through the chaos of the Revolutionary Wars. By the time he reached his mid-20s, he was commanding armies. During the Italian campaign, he showcased his remarkable capabilities. He defeated the Austrians, established new republics, and brought entire regions under French control, not through sheer brutality, but through efficiency and calculated bravery. Napoleon was not a conqueror in the conventional sense. He viewed war as an extension of politics, a tool to create an order shaped in his image. When he assumed control of the government in the year 9 through a coup, many French citizens felt a sense of relief. The first consul, as he called himself, restored calm, not through democratic discourse, but through clear directives, laws, and military discipline. Yet, Napoleon craved more. Power alone was insufficient for him. He saw permanence, he sought immortality. In the year 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in the Notre Dame Cathedral, in the presence of the Pope, but without allowing the Pope to place the crown upon his head. It was a gesture laden with symbolism. Napoleon claimed what he believed was rightfully his. France became the center of a new empire. The administration was modernized, and the legal system was unified. The Code Civil emerged, a legal framework that continues to have an impact today. Schools, universities, and government agencies were all restructured. The people felt the palpable changes in their daily lives. Order reigned, but so did control. Europe, on the other hand, perceived Napoleon as a significant threat. Numerous wars ensued against Austria, Prussia, Russia, and England. In the early phase of his empire, Napoleon emerged victorious in many of these battles. The names of his triumphs, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, etched themselves into the memories of an entire generation. However, as Napoleon advanced further into enemy territories, his paths grew longer, and his power became increasingly fragile. In the memorable year of 1812, he embarked on a fateful campaign against Russia. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed the border, but what lay ahead was not an open battlefield. Instead, they faced a grueling retreat. The Russian army strategically withdrew, setting cities ablaze and destroying supplies along the way. The French forces were left to contend with bitter cold, relentless hunger, and an endless march into desolation. Only a fraction of them managed to return alive. This catastrophic setback marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Europe began to unite once again against him. Formerly fragmented, his adversaries rallied together. In the monumental Battle of Leipzig in 1813, he suffered a decisive defeat. A year later, Allied troops marched triumphantly into Paris. Napoleon was compelled to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Yet, the Emperor of the French was not prepared to conclude his saga so quietly. In March of the following year, he made a dramatic return. accompanied by a small band of loyal followers, but with an unyielding spirit. He traversed France, and wherever he appeared, soldiers flocked to his side. The populace erupted in cheers. King Louis fled in haste. For 100 days, Napoleon reigned once more, a final burst of brilliance, a last gamble. The decisive moment arrived at Waterloo in June of 1815. The battle was lost, and this time there would be no turning back. Napoleon surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, he lived until his death in the year 1820, far removed from the glory and power he once wielded, confined to a modest house beneath a grey sky. Napoleon's legacy remains complex and ambivalent. He waged wars, destroyed cities, and occupied nations. Yet, he also initiated reforms, modernized the law, and bolstered the self-confidence of an entire nation. He was not merely a military leader, he was also the architect of a new Europe. His name endured in the hearts of many French citizens, not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of strength, order, and grandeur. Even though the empire he forged eventually crumbled, the marks he left behind did not vanish. Following Napoleon's fall, not only did a new ruler return to France, but an old idea re-emerged: the monarchy. In the year 1815, Louis XVIII ascended the throne, a brother of the king who had once been executed. For many, this signified a return to order, to old forms, and to a time before revolution and empire. However, France was no longer the nation Louis remembered. Society had transformed. The bourgeoisie had gained strength. The country was now interwoven with new laws, ideas, and memories. There was no simple way back to the past. The restoration of the monarchy was not a fresh start, but rather a delicate balancing act between the past and the present. The king established a constitutional monarchy, introducing a charter that guaranteed certain rights, yet much remained uncertain. In the streets, people engaged in fervent discussions about politics, philosophy, and literature. This era was not marked by grand wars or upheavals, but rather by a struggle for interpretation. What did it mean to be French? Which narrative should be told? The one of the king or that of the revolution? As the old elites sought to regain their influence, a new cultural movement began to emerge: Romanticism. Poets, painters, and composers turned away from reliance on order and reason, instead embracing emotion, nature, and memory. The works of Victor Hugo, the paintings of Eugène Delacroix, and the music of Hector Berlioz spoke of longing, rebellion, and profound introspection. While this artistic movement was not political in the traditional sense, it reflected a restlessness felt by many. People dreamed, yet they did not forget. The pain of the past lingered like fine dust over everything that sought to be new. Following the death of King Louis XVIII, his brother Charles X ascended to the throne. However, his conservative policies led to rising tensions. He attempted to restrict press freedom, narrow the electoral franchise, and strengthen the power of the church. Yet society had become more alert and aware. In the early days of July, a revolt erupted in Paris. Barricades were erected, and street battles shook the capital. Once again, it was the common people who made history. Charles was forced to abdicate. The monarchy survived, but under different circumstances. Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans, was appointed as the citizen king. He ruled not in the name of divine order, but as a mediator between the crown and the people. His reign was characterized by pragmatism, yet it also saw a growing divide between the rich and the poor, as industrialization began to take hold, quietly and inexorably. Steam engines and factories transformed the landscape of the cities. A new proletariat emerged, bringing with it new questions. People migrated from rural areas to urban centers, living in cramped apartments and working under harsh conditions. Who would represent their interests? What rights did workers have, and how could social justice be achieved? France was once again in motion, though in a different manner than before. The revolution was no longer a singular storm, but a constant murmur in the background. Every political move was scrutinized, commented upon, and debated. The memory of the past was too present to be ignored. The international stage also played a significant role. European powers observed France closely. The nation was still regarded as unpredictable, a laboratory for ideas that were considered dangerous elsewhere. Yet at the same time, it served as a model for nationalism, civil rights, and cultural flourishing. Internally, there was a quiet tremor. People were uncertain about the direction in which the nation was headed, but they sensed that something was brewing beneath the surface. The streets of Paris once again echoed with voices, poems, songs, and questions that could no longer be silenced. France was a nation that dreamed, but it was no longer merely dreaming of heroism or honor. Instead, it dreamt of justice, education, and participation. Deep within these dreams lay the seeds for the next upheaval, which would not be long in coming. France's history had always been marked by turmoil, but in the month of February in the year 1848, another significant upheaval occurred that profoundly affected society. Once again, it was not armies or ministers that dictated the course of events, but rather the people in the streets, men, women, workers and students. They all felt that the promise of progress had not been fulfilled. Under King Louis Philippe, often referred to as the Citizen King, France had undergone transformation. A constitutional monarchy had been established, a chamber was elected, and there was economic growth. However, this prosperity did not reach many. Political participation was limited, with voting rights held by a wealthy minority. For the common people, little remained. High food prices, precarious employment, and a lack of prospects plagued their daily lives. Compounding these issues was a changing consciousness. In the cafes of the major cities, writings on equality and workers' rights circulated. Socialists like Louis Blanc called for state-guaranteed employment. The press became more vibrant and courageous, and independent thought could no longer be confined. A single spark was all that was needed to ignite the pent-up dissatisfaction. In February, protests erupted in Paris, triggered by the ban on public banquets, which had become a popular substitute for political gatherings. The police responded with brutal force, leading to barricades, gunfire, and ultimately the flight of the king. Louis Philippe fled the country in haste, disguised as an ordinary citizen. The last monarch of France, descended from royal lineage, departed without a crown, without farewells, and without plans for a return. In his place emerged a new government, the Second Republic. For the first time in the history of France, universal male suffrage was introduced. Millions of Frenchmen were now allowed to cast their votes. Peasants, workers, artisans. It was a moment of historical significance. The Republic promised work, education, and justice. Across Europe, eyes turned towards Paris, for it appeared that something had been achieved there that elsewhere was still regarded as a utopia. Yet, this unity would not endure for long. In the initial months following the revolution, the gap between ideals and reality widened. The economic situation remained tense, and supply issues went unresolved. In the capital, the sense of disappointment was palpable. When in June, the so-called national workshops were closed, a program aimed at providing employment for the unemployed, a new uprising erupted. The working class of Paris felt betrayed and disillusioned. This time, the fierce battles unfolded not between the populace and the monarchy, but rather within the populace itself. The government's response was severe and uncompromising. The army intervened, resulting in the deaths of thousands of insurgents, while many others were arrested or deported. The revolution, which had initially sparked hope and enthusiasm, descended into renewed violence and deepening division. The republican ideals that had once inspired so many began to falter under the weight of this turmoil. Amidst this uncertainty, a name emerged that evoked memories of a greater past. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the illustrious emperor, had previously remained politically inconspicuous. However, during the elections for the presidency of the Republic, he garnered overwhelming support. The French people, weary of chaos and endless conflict, saw in him a beacon of stability, a familiar silhouette promising a new beginning. Louis Napoleon spoke of order, prosperity, and national pride. His speeches were forthright, and his messages were straightforward. In the memorable year of 1849, he assumed the presidency, but it soon became evident that he had no intention of stepping down after 4 years. By December of 1852, bolstered by a referendum, he declared himself emperor. The Republic was at an end, and the Second Empire was born. From that moment on, Napoleon I ruled with near absolute power. Thus, the Revolution of 1848 did not conclude with the anticipated triumph of freedom, but instead ushered in a new ruler, a new title, and a new order. Even though the ideals of the Revolution appeared to be buried for the time being, they had left indelible marks on the fabric of society. As Louis Napoleon Bonaparte donned the imperial crown in December of 1852, France found itself once again under an era of personal rule. However, unlike his famous uncle, the new emperor did not aspire to be merely a conqueror. He envisioned himself as a mediator between the past and the future, a modern monarch cloaked in republican ideals. He adopted the title Napoleon II, despite the fact that Napoleon II, the son of the first emperor, had never officially ruled. In this name lay a claim to continuity, remembrance, and grandeur. Yet, at the same time, he aimed to avoid the pitfalls of the past. Rather than the sword, he sought to place economic progress, social balance, and national unity at the forefront of his reign. The Second Empire commenced with a period of economic upswing. The emperor initiated the construction of railways, modernized ports, and expanded industrial zones. France underwent palpable transformation. Cities flourished, machines began to replace manual labor, and international trade connections strengthened the nation. Under the guidance of Baron Haussmann, the boulevards of Paris were reimagined. Narrow alleys were transformed into wide avenues, and drab neighborhoods evolved into elegant districts. The new Paris emerged as a metropolis of light, fashion, and modernity, embodying the aspirations of its time. In the realm of foreign policy, Napoleon II sought avenues to enhance France's standing on the global stage. He lent support to the struggle for freedom in Italy against the Habsburgs, intervened in Mexico, and participated in the Crimean War, all while striving to reshape the balance of power in Europe. However, these ambitious expeditions proved costly and were not always met with success. Particularly disastrous was the venture in Mexico, which culminated in catastrophe. The emperor installed there, Maximilian, was overthrown and executed. Napoleon had overreached, and domestically he pursued a policy of gradual liberalization. He permitted greater press freedom, allowed for increased parliamentary participation, and encouraged political debates. This so-called liberal phase was not a radical break from the past, but rather a cautious evolution, a sincere attempt to merge monarchy with democracy. For many French citizens, this represented a glimmer of hope that perhaps a middle ground could be found between absolute rule and the instability of republicanism. Yet, France was not alone in its challenges. In Eastern Europe, a new competitor was rising, Prussia, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. The Prussian Chancellor had a clear agenda: and in this strategic landscape, France appeared more as an adversary than a potential ally. Tensions escalated, culminating in the year 1870. A diplomatic dispute over the Spanish throne quickly spiraled into a war that many Frenchmen welcomed, driven by national pride, historical memories, and a sense of overconfidence. The Franco-Prussian War commenced with high expectations, but ended in a dismal failure. The French forces were ill-prepared, poorly led, and confronted a modern, well-organized Prussian army. By September, the emperor himself was captured at Sedan. This was more than a mere military defeat. It was a symbolic collapse of the regime. Panic erupted in Paris. The populace rose up, proclaimed the Republic, and toppled the empire. Napoleon II was exiled, marking the fall of the Second Empire in a sudden and definitive manner, devoid of any heroic farewell. However, the conclusion of the war was still distant. Prussian troops advanced toward Paris, besieging the capital, starving it, and wearing down its spirit. During this tumultuous period, a new movement emerged, the Paris Commune. Workers, socialists, and idealists took control of the city's administration, declaring radical reforms and striving to forge a new society from the ground up, free from government and military oversight. Yet, the national government, now based in Versailles, retaliated. Violent clashes erupted in the streets of Paris. The Commune was ruthlessly suppressed, resulting in thousands being killed or deported. The dream of a more equitable order had been extinguished. For the time being, France was left in a state of turmoil once again, torn between monarchy, republic, and empire. In just a few decades, the nation had navigated through all forms of governance, yet none had managed to establish a lasting foothold. The question of the right path forward was more open than ever. Yet, amidst all this turmoil, something had solidified. The awareness that France was more than just its rulers. The people were thinking, fighting, and leading. History was no longer merely the domain of kings or generals. It had become a collective responsibility. Following the fall of the Second Empire, France lay exhausted and wounded on the ground. The defeat in the war against Prussia not only had military repercussions, but also left a deep scar on. Yet, France was not alone in its challenges. In Eastern Europe, a new competitor was rising, Prussia, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. The Prussian Chancellor had a clear agenda, and in this strategic landscape, France appeared more as an adversary than a potential ally. Tensions escalated, culminating in the year 1870. A diplomatic dispute over the Spanish throne quickly spiraled into a war that many Frenchmen welcomed, driven by national pride, historical memories, and a sense of overconfidence. The Franco-Prussian War commenced with high expectations, but ended in a dismal failure. The French forces were ill-prepared, poorly led, and confronted a modern, well-organized Prussian army. By September, the emperor himself was captured at Sedan. This was more than a mere military defeat. It was a symbolic collapse of the regime. Panic erupted in Paris. The populace rose up, proclaimed the Republic, and toppled the empire. Napoleon II was exiled, marking the fall of the Second Empire in a sudden and definitive manner, devoid of any heroic farewell. However, the conclusion of the war was still distant. Prussian troops advanced towards Paris, besieging the capital, starving it, and wearing down its spirit. During this tumultuous period, a new movement emerged, the Paris Commune. Workers, socialists, and idealists took control of the city's administration, declaring radical reforms and striving to forge a new society from the ground up, free from government and military oversight. Yet, the national government, now based in Versailles, retaliated. Violent clashes erupted in the streets of Paris. The Commune was ruthlessly suppressed, resulting in thousands being killed or deported. The dream of a more equitable order had been extinguished. For the time being, France was left in a state of turmoil once again, torn between monarchy, republic, and empire. In just a few decades, the nation had navigated through all forms of governance, yet none had managed to establish a lasting foothold. The question of the right path forward was more open than ever. Yet, amidst all this turmoil, something had solidified. The awareness that France was more than just its rulers. The people were thinking, fighting, and leading. History was no longer merely the domain of kings or generals. It had become a collective responsibility. Following the fall of the Second Empire, France lay exhausted and wounded on the ground. The defeat in the war against Prussia not only had military repercussions, but also left a deep scar on the national identity. The capital had been besieged, the provinces fragmented, and Alsace-Lorraine had fallen to the newly established German Empire, a loss that would pain the French heart for decades to come. Yet it was precisely in this moment of humiliation that a new order emerged. On the 4th of September, in the year 1870, the Third Republic was proclaimed. Not in a grand ceremony, nor with pomp, but as a pragmatic decision. The monarchy had been discredited, the Bonapartists defeated, and the Republic appeared to be the only viable path forward. Initially, it was fragile. The civil war between Paris and Versailles, culminating in the bloody suppression of the Paris Commune, had left deep rifts. The political factions stood irreconcilably opposed to one another: monarchists, republicans, and socialists. Each sought a different vision for France, each claiming the legacy of the past as their own. Despite these challenges, the Third Republic managed to assert itself, not through grand gestures, but through persistent administrative work, the establishment of new institutions, and a continuous struggle for stability. The Republican idea was gradually integrated into everyday life. Schools were reformed, the separation of church and state was advanced, and the public education system was expanded. Millions of children began to learn to read and write in French in Republican schools, far removed from the pulpits and monasteries. It was a quiet revolution that fundamentally changed the landscape of the nation. Teachers, referred to as the Black Hussars of the Republic, carried the Republican values into even the smallest villages: liberty, equality, fraternity. The Republic was not only taught, it was lived. At the same time, the economic foundation of the country was strengthened. The expansion of the railway network connected the regions, while new industries emerged in northern France and the greater Paris area. Cities grew, and with them, the political self-awareness of the bourgeoisie and the working class flourished. However, the new France was not free from tensions. The Third Republic was often shaken by political crises. Governments changed rapidly, and motions of no confidence, scandals, and rivalries characterized the political climate. There was no stable majority, only a precarious balance that had to be recalibrated time and again. One of the most significant internal conflicts in France erupted in the year 1894, known as the Dreyfus Affair. A Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was wrongfully accused of treason and subsequently deported to Devil's Island, a punishment that marked a dark chapter in French history. This case divided the nation into two opposing camps: those who believed in his guilt and those who demanded justice. Intellectuals, such as Émile Zola, raised their voices against this injustice, denouncing anti-Semitism and the abuse of state power. The Dreyfus Affair transcended a mere legal dispute. It served as a reflection of France during that era, torn between tradition and enlightenment, between militarism and civil rights, and between the weight of history and the aspirations of a more egalitarian society. Ultimately, Dreyfus was exonerated, but the damage to public trust in institutions was profound. and the wounds inflicted by this debate healed only slowly. Despite the internal strife, the Third Republic evolved into one of the most enduring political orders in French history. It weathered political assassinations, economic crises, and ideological battles. Its strength lay in its remarkable flexibility, its capacity to endure conflicts, and its ability to forge compromises. In parliamentary debates, voices from various social strata resonated, creating a polyphonic, sometimes chaotic, but ultimately stable chorus. Simultaneously, France re-emerged on the global stage, expanding its colonial empire in Africa and Asia. New administrative structures were established overseas, and France presented itself as a modern power. However, this imperial ambition brought about new tensions with other great powers, as well as challenges to its own identity and the ideals that had once emerged from the Revolution. Thus, by the end of the 19th century, France faced a dual reality, internally characterized by progress and institutional strength, while externally entangled in a new global power struggle. The tricolour flag flew not only over Paris, but also over Algiers, Saigon, and Dakar. Yet, in the streets of the homeland, memories of defeat and hope persisted. The Republic was not a perfect system, but it embodied a promise of participation, education, and a brighter future. By the summer of that year, it appeared that France had reached the pinnacle of its republican stability. Cities were expanding, progress was evident, schools were disseminating knowledge, and faith in the achievements of the Third Republic was deeply rooted. However, this belief would soon be shaken by an event that would alter not only the map of Europe, but also the internal fabric of France for decades to come: the First World War. Triggered by the assassination in Sarajevo, a chain reaction of political alliances, national rivalries, and colonial tensions ignited into a conflagration. When the German Empire declared war on France in August of that same year, the nation seemed prepared to face the ensuing turmoil. The memory of the defeat in the year 1870 was still fresh in the minds of many. A significant number believed that the forthcoming conflict would be a brief yet heroic campaign, a chance to reclaim the pride that had been thought lost. However, what transpired was far from a glorious expedition. It turned into a grueling 4-year ordeal that gnawed at the landscape, the bodies, and the very hearts of the people. France became one of the central battlegrounds of the war. The front lines stretched across the nation, from Belgium to the Swiss border. Millions of soldiers entrenched themselves in muddy trenches, where rats, rain, and death became part of their daily existence. The war transformed everything. The industrial modernity infiltrated warfare, introducing machine guns, poison gas, and artillery shells of unprecedented ferocity. Battles such as those at Verdun and the Somme became symbols of futility. Verdun alone claimed over 600,000 lives and left countless others wounded, all for barely shifted front lines. The impact of the war was felt deeply at home as well. Women took on roles in factories, fields, and government offices, filling the void left by men who had gone to fight. Children grew up without their fathers, while families waited for years for letters, news, or the return of their loved ones, often left in uncertainty. However, this belief would soon be shaken by an event that would alter not only the map of Europe, but also the internal fabric of France for decades to come: the First World War. Triggered by the assassination in Sarajevo, a chain reaction of political alliances, national rivalries, and colonial tensions ignited into a conflagration. When the German Empire declared war on France in August of that same year, the nation seemed prepared to face the ensuing turmoil. The memory of the defeat in the year 1870 was still fresh in the minds of many. A significant number believed that the forthcoming conflict would be a brief yet heroic campaign, a chance to reclaim the pride that had been thought lost. However, What transpired was far from a glorious expedition. It turned into a grueling 4-year ordeal that gnawed at the landscape, the bodies, and the very hearts of the people. France became one of the central battlegrounds of the war. The front lines stretched across the nation, from Belgium to the Swiss border. Millions of soldiers entrenched themselves in muddy trenches, where rats, rain, and death became part of their daily existence. The war transformed everything. The industrial modernity infiltrated warfare, introducing machine guns, poison gas, and artillery shells of unprecedented ferocity. Battles such as those at Verdun and the Somme became symbols of futility. Verdun alone claimed over 600,000 lives and left countless others wounded, all for barely shifted front lines. The impact of the war was felt deeply at home as well. Women took on roles in factories, fields, and government offices, filling the void left by men who had gone to fight. Children grew up without their fathers, while families waited for years for letters, news, or the return of their loved ones, often left in uncertainty. The war permeated every street, every newspaper, and every conversation. The government called for national unity under the banner of the Union Sacrée. Political factions that had previously been irreconcilable began to rally together. Yet, as the war dragged on, the solidarity began to fracture. Desertions increased, and strikes shook the home front. The question of the meaning behind these endless battles grew louder. France endured out of pride, a sense of duty and fear. Support came from allies, particularly from the United Kingdom and later from the United States of America. In the year 1918, following the German Spring Offensive and the successful counteroffensive by the Allies, the German Empire collapsed. On the 11th of November, the guns fell silent. France had achieved victory, militarily, politically, and symbolically. Yet, the cost was immeasurable. Over 1.5 million French lives had been lost. Countless others were wounded, maimed, and traumatized. Vast regions, especially in the northeast, lay in ruins. Villages were obliterated, and forests were riddled with craters from shells. The war had not only destroyed bodies, but also shattered certainties. The post-war period was marked by rebuilding and remembrance. In every village, monuments were erected, names engraved, and flowers laid in tribute. The so-called generation of 1914 became a silent reminder of the war's horrors. The conflict had revealed the depths of humanity's capacity for both good and evil. Simultaneously, France sought to draw political strength from its victory. At the Versailles Conference, it not only gained territorial acquisitions but also reparations. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to French territory, a gesture laden with significance. However, the relationship with the former enemy remained poisoned, and the peace was fragile. Internally, the Republic was also under strain. The economic damage was immense. Many men returned as invalids, their lives irrevocably altered. The social fabric of the nation was shaken. Women began to demand greater rights, while workers staged strikes for better conditions. Intellectuals sought new orientations in a world that had been turned upside down. The war had drained the country, but also politicized it. The Third Republic managed to endure this stress test, yet its structures began to creak under the weight of expectations and reality. The pressing question was, how does a nation cope with a victory that feels like a defeat? How does one tend to wounds that are not visible? And how does one maintain peace in a rapidly changing world? France entered the interwar period with downcast eyes and heavy hearts. It was a nation counting its dead, sorting its debts, licking its wounds, and acutely aware that the next storm might already be lurking on the horizon. In the aftermath of the First World War, France appeared outwardly as a victor. However, Internally, the country was wounded, weary, and deeply uncertain. The price of victory was staggering. Over 1.5 million soldiers had fallen, millions more were injured, cities lay in ruins, and landscapes were scorched. Entire regions in the north and east of France were barely recognizable, scarred by the ravages of war. The Third Republic continued to exist, but beneath the surface, doubts festered. How could peace be built when the pain lingered in every family? How could economic recovery be achieved when the workforce was diminished and the burden of debt was growing heavier? And how could a political order be maintained when trust in institutions was crumbling? In the initial years following 1918, France faced immense challenges. The reconstruction was arduous. Factories needed repairs, railway lines required renewal, and housing had to be created. Particularly in rural areas, the scarcity of tools, labor, and even hope was palpable. Politically, the era was marked by instability. Governments changed rapidly. At times, conservative forces dominated, while at others, leftist coalitions took the lead. No government held power for long. The parliamentary democracy, which had been painstakingly established during peacetime, began to falter under the pressures of crisis. Many citizens perceived the political landscape as fragmented, sluggish, and unreliable. Simultaneously, society was undergoing transformation. Women, who had worked in factories and offices during the war, were demanding more rights. Yet the right to vote continued to be denied to them. The youth sought new values and ideals. Artists and intellectuals responded to the disillusionment with literature, theatre, and film. Paris remained a cultural centre of Europe, yet its former lustre had begun to show signs of wear. Economically, the situation was unstable. Inflation surged and unemployment rose, casting a shadow over the nation's recovery efforts. France attempted to assert its claims against Germany, demanding reparations as compensation for the damages incurred during the war. However, when these payments faltered, French troops occupied the Ruhr region in the year 1923. This action, intended to restore economic stability, instead sparked widespread protest and escalated tensions with their eastern neighbor. Despite these challenges, there were periods of hope. In the latter half of the 1920s, France experienced a brief economic revival. Cities thrived, cafes buzzed with life, and variety shows attracted audiences from far and wide. Artists from all corners of the globe flocked to Paris, drawn by its vibrant cultural scene. Yet, this facade of prosperity was deceptive. The global economy remained fragile, and France's social tensions persisted, unresolved and simmering beneath the surface. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged France into a downward spiral. The Great Depression struck hard, crippling industries, paralyzing trade, and causing unemployment figures to soar. The government endeavored to counteract the economic decline, but each relief program faced significant political roadblocks. Amid this uncertainty, the influence of extremist factions began to rise. On the streets, right-wing groups marched, rallying against parliament, socialists, and foreigners with inflammatory slogans. They envisioned an authoritarian order and a national renewal. In opposition stood leftist movements, trade unions, and communists, equally radical but driven by different ideals. The societal divide deepened. The political center lost its credibility, while voices on the fringes grew increasingly loud. The specter of a civil war loomed large. In February of 1934, violent unrest erupted in Paris, ignited by right-wing demonstrations that spiraled out of control. The Republic wavered, yet it did not collapse. In response to the chaos, the Popular Front emerged in the year 1936, a coalition of socialists, radicals, and communists. Their victory in the parliamentary elections sent a clear message. Many French citizens yearned for social justice, reforms, and peace, rather than dictatorship. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Léon Blum, working hours were reduced, vacations were introduced, and trade unions were strengthened. However, significant resistance to these measures arose. Business owners protested, conservatives incited discontent, and factions within the army murmured dissent. The Popular Front barely lasted 2 years before it crumbled under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, a new shadow loomed on the horizon. Adolf Hitler had seized power in Germany, while Italy was under Mussolini's rule. A civil war raged in Spain. Fascism was gaining strength, and France found itself in the midst of it all, lacking a clear strategy or unified leadership. The Third Republic still stood, but its foundation was crumbling. The fear of another war, the haunting memories of the last bloodshed, and the escalating tensions in Europe caused the nation to stagger. People hoped for peace, yet they understood that such tranquility would not endure for long. In September of 1939, France declared war on the German Reich. The Wehrmacht had invaded Poland, and the treaty with Great Britain compelled France to intervene. However, what followed was not a swift counterattack. Instead, the front line became stagnant, resulting in what was known as the Sitzkrieg, a period marked by many months of relative inactivity with hardly any battles. The French waited and held on to hope. Yet the war they sought to avoid arrived with brutal ferocity. In May of 1940, the German offensive commenced. Within a matter of weeks, armored divisions breached the defensive lines, circumvented the Maginot Line, and forced French troops into a retreat. Paris fell on the 14th of June without a fight. This was a defeat that shook the nation to its core. France, once regarded as a formidable power in Europe, collapsed in just a few weeks. The government capitulated, and the country was divided. The northern and western regions fell under German occupation, while the south became known as the Free Zone, administered by the authoritarian Vichy regime under Marshal Philippe Pétain. This new regime claimed to be saving France, yet it collaborated with the occupiers. Jewish citizens were stripped of their rights, arrested, and deported. The hope for sovereignty turned out to be an illusion. Many French people were left in disbelief. Some adapted to the new reality, while others rebelled quietly. However, in the shadows of dictatorship, resistance began to emerge. The Résistance, a loose network of communists, republicans, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, started to grow. In cellars, attics, mountains, and forests, they organized acts of sabotage, assisted the persecuted in their escape, and gathered intelligence for the Allies. Their resources were limited, but their courage was immense. Concurrently, a voice arose from exile. Charles de Gaulle, a previously little-known general, addressed his people from London. In his famous speech on the 18th of June 1940, he called upon the French to resist. The Free French forces under his command became the military arm of the resistance abroad. His voice became a symbol of unyielding hope. As battles raged in North Africa, Russia, and later Italy, France also prepared for the day of liberation. That day arrived in June of 1944. The Allies landed in Normandy, supported by French partisans. This marked the beginning of the end of German occupation. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August, not solely by foreign troops, but also by French fighters defending their city. The return of the tricolour flag on the Eiffel Tower was a moment of profound symbolism. General de Gaulle entered the Hôtel de Ville and declared, "Paris, Paris is outraged. Paris is freeing itself." The war was not entirely over for France, but victory was on the horizon. In May of 1945, the Second World War in Europe came to an end with the unconditional surrender of Germany. France was free, but it bore the scars of conflict. Over 600,000 French citizens had lost their lives. The country lay in ruins, economically weakened and politically torn apart. In the memorable month of May in the year 1945, the Second World War in Europe came to a definitive end with the unconditional surrender of Germany. France was liberated, but it bore the deep scars of conflict. The wounds from collaboration, persecution, and resistance were still fresh and visible. Yet, from these ashes, a new France began to rise. Charles de Gaulle emerged as the leader of the provisional government. His vision was resolute. There would be no regression into chaos, no return to the political disputes that had characterized the pre-war era. He aspired to establish a strong, unified state founded on republican values. Simultaneously, the nation underwent a significant social restructuring. Social security was introduced, and the education system was reinforced. Women finally gained the right to vote, a milestone for which many had fought for decades. France sought not only to rise from the ruins, but also to renew itself. However, the post-war period remained complex and fraught with difficulties. The memories of guilt and betrayal could not be easily shaken off. Many former collaborators faced justice, while others evaded accountability. Society had to learn to live with its past, not through forgetting, but through remembrance. France now faced a new challenge: to find a balance between its past and its future, between commemoration and reconstruction. The war had destroyed much, yet it had also unleashed forces that would shape the nation moving forward. The idea of resistance, of standing firm against injustice, remained deeply embedded in the collective memory of the French people. As the last German soldier departed from France, the country was no longer the same as it had been in 1939. It had aged, been wounded, and matured. Yet, it was also determined to redefine its place in the world. Following the conclusion of the Second World War, France entered a new phase in its history. The joy of liberation was still palpable as the nation began to reorganize itself. In the year 1966, the Fourth Republic was proclaimed, accompanied by a new constitution, new institutions, and yet old uncertainties. The people longed for stability. They did not wish to return to the political turmoil of the interwar years. Nevertheless, the Fourth Republic was from the outset a fragile construct, marked by compromises, power struggles, and short-lived governments. Within a mere 12 years, over 20 cabinets changed hands. The parliamentary structure was vibrant yet unstable. At the same time, France faced a monumental challenge that played out not in Paris, but in its overseas territories: the disintegration of its colonial empire. For centuries, France had built a vast and complex empire across Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and Oceania. Millions of individuals lived under French rule, often deprived of rights, lacking participation in governance, and with no prospects for equality. However, the world had undergone significant changes. The spirit of freedom that was celebrated within France began to resonate in its colonies as well. In the aftermath of the war, numerous nations demanded their independence through words, protests, and armed resistance. France, simultaneously weakened and proud, responded with a contradictory approach. This internal conflict was particularly evident in Indochina. In Vietnam, a communist-influenced independence movement had emerged under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The French attempt to restore the old order escalated into a bloody conflict. France found itself not merely battling soldiers, but rather confronting an idea: the will for self-determination. The year 1954 marked a pivotal defeat at Dien Bien Phu, where French troops were encircled and ultimately forced to surrender. The war concluded, leading to the division of Vietnam. France retreated, suffering a significant loss of prestige in Southeast Asia. Barely had this conflict subsided when another erupted in Algeria. Unlike Vietnam, Algeria was not a conventional colony. It was formerly considered part of France. Over 1 million people of French descent lived there alongside several million Muslim Algerians who faced systematic discrimination. The demands for equality, and later for independence, fell on deaf ears. This led to massacres, torture, and retaliatory violence. The Algerian War became a profound trauma, not only due to its brutality, but also because it challenged the core of French identity. How could a nation that proclaimed freedom and human rights defend its rule with such ferocity? The war created deep divisions within French society. In Paris, intellectuals and students protested against the violence. Dissent grew within the military ranks, while the political leadership struggled to respond effectively. By the year 1958, the situation escalated further. French generals in Algeria threatened a coup, and the Republic stood once again on the brink of collapse. In this moment of crisis, attention turned to an old acquaintance, Charles de Gaulle. The aging general, who had long been in political retirement, was recalled as a last hope and a guarantor of order. Under immense pressure, he assumed power and initiated the drafting of a new constitution. Thus, in the year 1959, the Fifth Republic was established, with a strong president at its helm. De Gaulle was no supporter of colonialism. Despite his military background, he recognized that the era of empires had come to an end. By 1962, Algeria achieved independence after a protracted and bloody struggle. Over 1 million individuals fled the country towards France. The scars of this war remained deep on both sides of the Mediterranean. France gradually withdrew from Africa as well, with nations like Senegal, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, and Cameroon declaring their independence. France formally bid farewell to its colonial past, yet it retained significant economic and political influence over its former territories. While the era of colonialism had come to an end, the legacy of that time continued to resonate deeply. The Fourth Republic had navigated through considerable upheavals, but ultimately, it faltered under the weight of its internal contradictions. This period in French history was one of transition, evolving from an empire to a nation, moving from authoritarian impulses toward democratic maturity, and shifting from the luster of its glorious past to the intricate complexities of modernity. At the conclusion of this chapter, France found itself in a state of loss, yet it had also learned valuable lessons about redefinition and resilience. The age of empires had drawn to a close, but a new chapter was beginning to unfold. Europe was in motion, society was undergoing transformation, and the Republic stood more firmly than ever before. In the year 1958, as Charles de Gaulle re-entered the political arena, France stood at a pivotal crossroads. The Fourth Republic had descended into chaos. The Algerian War, governmental instability, and a pervasive sense of increasing impotence had worn down the populace. Many citizens were not yearning for revolution. Rather, they sought order. They believed that only de Gaulle could restore that stability. De Gaulle was not an ordinary politician. He was a soldier, a visionary, occasionally arrogant, yet often unyielding. His return to power was not achieved through the ballot box, but rather through the pressures of crisis and his own commanding presence. However, he was no dictator. He sought the endorsement of the people. In the year 1959, a new constitution was adopted, establishing the Fifth Republic. The essence of this constitution was the empowerment of the presidency. Unlike in previous republics, the president was no longer merely a representative, but a shaping force. The president had the authority to appoint ministers, dissolve the parliament, and dictate foreign policy. De Gaulle filled this office with considerable authority, and a clear vision of France's role in the world. For him, France was not simply one state among many. It was a nation with a mission, a rich history, and inherent dignity. This dignity could not end in foreign dependency, whether on the United States or the Soviet Union. France must be great, de Gaulle asserted. It must be autonomous, sovereign, and independent. This ambition was reflected in many of his decisions. France withdrew from NATO's military structures, developed its own nuclear arsenal, and pursued an independent foreign policy. De Gaulle visited countries that others shunned and engaged with powers that others ignored. He desired for France to have a voice, not as an echo, but as a source of influence. Internally, the Fifth Republic sought economic modernization. During the 1960s, France experienced significant growth. New highways were constructed, industrial zones were established, and universities expanded. Agriculture became mechanized, and living standards improved dramatically. This era was known as the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of economic expansion and prosperity. However, not everyone benefited equally from these changes. In the suburbs of major cities, in factories, and on university campuses, discontent began to grow. The youth felt increasingly misunderstood by the old order. Workers demanded better conditions, and in May of 1968, a massive wave of protests erupted. Strikes, demonstrations, and street battles ensued. This was more than just a rebellion. It represented a profound cultural rupture that challenged the authority of the state, the church, and the family. All of these institutions were called into question. Initially, President Charles de Gaulle was at a loss, even retreating briefly from the country in response to the turmoil. However, he returned, called for new elections, and managed to secure victory once again. Yet the tide was turning, and his star began to fade. In the year 1970, he stepped down, having sensed that his time in power had come to an end. Following de Gaulle, Georges Pompidou assumed the presidency. Later, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, François Mitterrand, and Jacques Chirac would each take their turn at the helm. Each of these leaders left their unique imprint on the Fifth Republic, yet the fundamental structure remained intact. The president continued to be the central figure of power. The political landscape was now more stable than it had ever been in the history of France. At the same time, the country underwent profound transformations. Society became more open, modern, and diverse. Women fought for and achieved new rights, while minorities demanded visibility and representation. European integration moved to the forefront of political discourse. France became a member of the European Community, which later evolved into the European Union. The French franc was replaced by the euro, and national decisions increasingly shifted to be coordinated in Brussels. Despite all these renewals, France remained proud of its language, culture, and history. Debates emerged surrounding national identity, secularism, and immigration. Yet, the Fifth Republic had learned to live with contradictions. It was not a perfect system, but it was a stable one. Charles de Gaulle had by then become a historical figure. In the eyes of many French citizens, he was the architect of the modern state, a man with flaws, yet also with great vision. His speeches were quoted, his policies analyzed, and his myth carefully nurtured. Thus, France, which had oscillated between monarchy, republic, and empire, transformed into a modern state, confident, at times rebellious, yet capable of self-correction. The Fifth Republic became the longest-lasting political system in French history since the Revolution of 1989. At the dawn of the 21st century, France emerged as a nation with many faces. It is the republic of human rights, of cathedrals and train stations, of ancient castles and modern subway lines. It is both proud and critical, open and contradictory, balancing between history and the present. The Eiffel Tower still towers over Paris, yet the country has changed. Today, society is more diverse than ever, with people from all parts of the former colonies living in France, shaping the streets, the culture, and the language. In Marseille, the vibrant sounds of Arabic melodies intertwine with the beloved notes of French chanson. Meanwhile, in Lyon, Asian restaurants share their spaces with traditional bistros, creating a rich tapestry of culinary experiences. This diversity is not just a celebrated reality, but also a source of tension within society. The values of the Republic, liberty, equality, and fraternity, are proudly displayed on many school walls. Yet they face significant challenges. The scars of terror attacks, political polarization, and social inequality have left their mark on the national consciousness. The question of what it truly means to be French today ignites passionate discussions in talk shows, classrooms, and cafes across the country. At the same time, France remains a bastion of innovation. In Toulouse, skilled engineers are engaged in the intricate art of aircraft construction. Bordeaux is home to some of the finest wines in the world, maturing in its lush vineyards. Meanwhile, in Grenoble, physicists are at the forefront of research on quantum computers, pushing the boundaries of technology. France is investing heavily in renewable energies, digitalization, and education, positioning itself as a key player in the European Union while maintaining a strong sense of national identity. The nation engages in lively debates, often marked by fervor and sometimes chaos, but never indifference. Politically, the landscape is fragmented. Traditional political parties have seen a decline in their influence, while new movements, some pro-European and others populist, dominate the discourse. Presidents come and go, and public distrust of elites is on the rise. Yet, despite these challenges, the Republic endures, bolstered by a deeply rooted democratic culture. On the international stage, France continues to play a significant role. As a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, it asserts its influence globally. French troops are deployed to conflict zones, and the country actively participates in climate negotiations, engaging with issues across Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. France's voice resonates on the world stage, sometimes controversial, but always respected. However, amidst this outward focus, the internal perspective remains crucial. The suburbs, known as banlieues, have become symbols of both hope and despair, potential and neglect. Here, a new generation is emerging, French yet distinctly different. They dance in public squares, create films, write poetry, and pose challenging questions that push the nation to reflect. France now faces monumental tasks ahead. The pressing realities of climate change demand innovative solutions, while an aging population calls for necessary reforms. The education system must strive for greater equity, and the social fabric of coexistence needs to be more peaceful. There are no simple answers, but there exists a profound desire to move forward collectively. Perhaps this is the true strength of the Republic, not its perfection, but its resilience against stagnation. It embraces dissent and endures crises, carrying its history like a heavy yet precious cloak. France remains in motion, propelled by millions of individuals weaving their unique stories into the grand narrative of the nation. In this France, farmers and bankers coexist with students and writers, Muslim women wearing headscarves alongside tattooed atheists, artists, and nurses. The old carry memories of war, while the young will one day come to understand the significance of it all. They are all part of a nation that has never been simple, yet has always thrived with vitality. Thus concludes this journey through the millennia, marked by wars and periods of peace, illuminated by splendor and shadowed by doubt. France, this defiant, proud, vulnerable, and captivating land, has continually reinvented itself, and it will undoubtedly do so once again tomorrow.